Hello, I'm Glendon Frank, and this is Frankly Speaking. In 2021, a little film called No Time to Die came out and marked the end of Daniel Craig's run as British super spy James Bond. There have been plenty of Bond movies, but No Time to Die feels to me like a unique phenomenon. There's never really been a final Bond movie like this. These movies are usually pretty episodic. You have clear, beat-by-beat structures and fun popcorn-level stakes. But with Craig's movies, there's been a clear shift to have Bond be a character with continuity, an arc, and features that consist from film to film and build up into something bigger. No Time to Die feels like a culmination of all of that. It's the sort of thing you couldn't do with any other Bond. I've talked on my blog, Frankly Speaking, about this sort of postmodern obsession that current franchises have with discussing themselves. Like, every movie in the Star Wars sequel trilogy can be read as a commentary on Star Wars as a brand. A lot of superhero movies feel concerned with justifying themselves to the audience.
But starting today, our company is now Meta.
Daniel Craig's run as James Bond feels like one of the clearest examples of this phenomenon. More than anything else, James Bond as a franchise seems intrinsically aware that its central character is kind of a lot. See, since its inception in 1953, the character of James Bond has been intrinsically tied to these outdated concepts of hot-blooded masculinity. Written in the tensions of the Cold War, Ian Fleming's novels were a form of escapism, presenting working-class male readers with a character who would be an expression of all their desires. He would set out to exotic locales with nice cars and nicer suits and defeat evil with top-of-the-line gadgets. Fleming's Bond was an extravagant sensualist, constantly eating the finest food and drinking the finest martinis. More than that, though, Bond was a male fantasy of sexuality. Fleming's Bond was flagrantly dismissive of women, seeing his various lovers purely as objects of conquest, consumption, and possession. We even invented a term for them, Bond Girl, a term that robs the women of all identity and frames them exclusively in relation to the spy. The movies broadly followed suit, sort of trying to update Bond over time, but always falling back into the same tropes. In 1995, with GoldenEye, Dame Judi Dench was cast as M, Bond's superior, giving a new feminine voice in Bond's story who could contrast and critique him. But at best, this always felt like a surface-level judgment. Dench's M accuses Pierce Brosnan's Bond of being a
sexist, misogynist dinosaur, a relic of the Cold War.
And the broader subtext of the movie asks whether Bond is still relevant in the modern age. But the movie ends with the assertion that Bond's old-fashioned methods are still a worthy opponent to the rising age of technology. We've acknowledged the flaws of Bond superficially, but we still need those tropes to make a Bond movie, so nothing actually changes. The year is now 2006, and Brosnan's Bond has come and gone. Despite the initial promise, Brosnan's run fell further and further back into a lot of the tropes of Bond, but especially the goofier tropes of Bond, borderline collapsing into total self-parody.
You know, I've missed your sparkling personality.
How's that for a punchline?
The producers wanted a new Bond who could reflect the more serious origins of the franchise and clean up Bond's public perception. So, to do this, they turned to a recent blockbuster that had done quite a similar thing: Christopher Nolan's Batman Begins. Batman 2 had become a goofy figure in the eyes of the public through the later Schumacher movies and the enduring legacy of the Adam West show. In approaching the Herculean task of adapting Batman into a more serious, grounded post-9/11 world, Nolan took what I'm hesitantly referring to as a deconstructionist approach. So here's a fun literary theory TLDR for you. In the mid-20th century, this guy, let's call him Jacques Derrida, used the word deconstruction in an extremely specific way, and an extremely specific context, and we have proceeded to wildly misinterpret him and use the word wrong ever since. I'm not actually that interested in Derrida's definition for this video because, again, it's so extremely specific and mostly asks about the source of meaning in a text, seeking to take control away from the author and put it back in the hands of the reader. That's an extremely loose interpretation, but that's not how most people use the term in the current age. The history between us and Derrida, if it even exists, is too complicated to get into, but let's define terms. In short, most people right now seem to understand deconstruction as a process, a theory of application. Deconstruction is importantly not destruction. It's not taking X thing apart for the joy of seeing thing in shambles. Rather, it's a system of breaking thing into pieces, studying all the pieces and how they function individually, how they connect, and often how you as the reader are related to those individual pieces, and then, this is important, putting them back together. Deconstruction is very often paired with reconstruction, as it is in Nolan's Batman Begins. In bringing Batman into the late 2000s, Nolan placed Bruce Wayne in a more serious world and spent the runtime exploring the psyche behind Wayne's actions. The entire first act of Batman Begins is dedicated to the idea of taking Batman apart, asking what would drive a person to do this? What makes a guy dress up as a bat and fight crime in the dead of night? Liam Neeson's character functions as a device to get to the heart of Bruce Wayne. It seems kind of old hat now, but this was a fresh way to study Batman's origin. Every single component of Batman has a psychological aspect to it. Everything has a reason for existing. This is how the deconstructionist approach comes to play. Nolan is taking apart Bruce Wayne's character and the tropes surrounding Batman piece by piece, and giving all of them a reason for being. Even the spikes on Batman's gauntlets have a reason for being. And by giving special importance to all these pieces individually, there's such a greater sense of catharsis when they all come together by the movie's end. That's reconstruction, building everything back into a final product that is familiar to us, but better than it ever was before. Nolan's Batman is a Batman who is better for having been deconstructed. The process makes him a deeper, more interesting character. Much like Batman Begins, Craig's first Bond movie essentially functions as an origin story. 2006's Casino Royale adapts Fleming's first novel in order to get back to the roots of a new, fresh-faced Bond, just having recently accepted his 00 status and still accommodating to the world of international espionage. Even as a novel, Casino Royale is a bizarre thing to read right now because it does very much feel like a character study of a person that we've already gotten to know. Especially after 20 Bond movies, there's something surprisingly fresh about turning to Casino Royale as a source, because it's a Bond absent of his usual gadgets, cars, and catchphrases. Craig's Bond has to earn his 00 status, he has to earn the Aston Martin, he has to even earn his theme. The iconic Bond theme, composed initially by Monty Norman, is absent for the majority of the film, replaced by a stylistically similar yet distinct theme built from Chris Cornell's opening credits song You Know My Name. Craig's Bond is familiar yet unknown, a Bond still on his way to becoming the Bond audiences know and love. The most dramatic change in Craig's Bond is one present even in the credits sequence, and that is its approach to women and femininity. While the opening credits of previous films tended to be filled with this visual consumption of women with very little trace of subtlety, Casino Royale's opening surprisingly is absent of that imagery entirely, instead focusing on minimalist introspections and featuring blank profiles of Bond while lyrics ask, "If you take a life, do you know what you'll give? Are you willing to die?" Casino Royale is immediately less interested in Bond as an escapist centralist, and more interested in exploring the broken identity of this MI6 agent. As part of that exploration, the dark history of misogyny is going to be put directly under the spotlight. A lot has been said about how Craig is a more stereotypically feminized Bond. He is constantly shirtless and sexualized, and in a shot that mirrors classic Bond girl iconography, Bond is displayed not just once but twice, emerging from the ocean dripping wet and semi-nude. But the idea of a more feminized Bond comes directly counter to the character's history, and this is a central question of the movie. Can Fleming's Bond find synthesis in the modern world? Cornell's opening song states that "You Know My Name," thrusting Bond's identity directly into the focus. Sure, we know his name, but what do we know about the man? The first act begins the process of deconstructing all the classic elements of Bond, displaying the struggle at the core of this new take on the character from beat 1. Casino Royale begins far before the events of the novel by depicting the 2 kills that earn Bond his 00 status. These kills are dramatically contrasted. The first is chaotic and bloody, the second is performed cleanly and with charisma. And the 2 scenes are heavily intercut and feature this distinct grain and black and white filter, really showing the fractured identity of Craig's Bond. Next, in the free-running sequence, we see Bond played up as a stubborn, physical force to be reckoned with, one who has little care for the rules or for the lives around him. And then we see blatantly the consequences of this rogue cop escapist fantasy, when M chastises him for being a blunt instrument who needs to put his ego aside and judge the mission dispassionately.
I knew it was too early to promote you.
Well, I understand 00s have a very short life expectancy.
Craig's Bond is flippant and reckless, and he'll need to learn discipline and self-control to be able to function in this world. He feels like an extreme version of the Bond we've come to know, physical masculinity at its most intense. But just like the opening kills, his reckless masculinity is contrasted by a suave, charismatic element, one that might read here as more stereotypically feminine. We go to the Bahamas, and Bond is constantly getting in and out of the water. The camera lingers on him constantly. Bond's mini-arc with Selene stands out. He seduces her, but it's more of a fully consensual fling. Bond needs information about her husband, Demetrius, and Demetrius has kind of been a tool to her, so she doesn't really mind sticking one to him and leaving with Bond. Bond is more playful and sensitive than he is domineering. He takes her for a spin, circling around the block. It's borderline silly, and the movie strongly implies that they never even sleep together. Bond just quickly runs away to catch Demetrius with the information that he has, and then fights Demetrius in a Body Worlds exhibit. But then, once Demetrius is out of the picture and Le Chiffre's initial plan to short the airplane stocks is foiled, Le Chiffre's men find and murder Selene, and the movie directly puts the blame on Bond. He roped her into this game, and he got her killed. We're kind of used to Bond getting into these affairs, but Casino Royale frames it as part of Bond's ever-expanding list of toxic traits, and it's setting up a pattern that becomes relevant in the movie. Bond's particular brand of masculinity is not only toxic to himself, but also to the people around him. Then, an hour into the runtime, we get to Vesper Lynd, who really hones in on our critique. The first scene between Lynd and Bond is a brilliant, playful piece of wordplay that immediately sets up their dynamic. It's pointed out that Lynd tends towards more stereotypically masculine clothing, and is a figure with power and agency over Bond, clearly demonstrating the way that the movie is playing with gender roles. Lynd here objectifies him instead of the other way around.
So as charming as you are, Mr. Bond, I will be keeping my eye on our government's money and off your perfectly formed house.
You noticed.
But more importantly, Vesper is able to match him intellectually, easily breaking down Bond's psyche and background, exposing his warped worldview and tendencies. Their beautifully playful dynamic continues throughout the movie. Bond picks out a gown for her to wear, intending to objectify her for his gain, the same way that Demetrius objectified Selene earlier in the movie. But Lind counters him because she's already picked out a fitted tuxedo for him for the same reason, and it's his dressing that the movie lingers on. Bond gets poisoned and his life is put at risk, and Vesper's the one who saves him. Vesper's more traditionally masculine tropes nudge Bond towards a more feminine role. The one moment that she isn't in control of the situation is during the assassination attempt. Bond caused Le Chiffre to lose mass sums of money earlier in the movie, and the people Le Chiffre owns are coming to collect. It's worth noting that they first threatened Le Chiffre's girlfriend Valencia, and Le Chiffre doesn't seem to care. The movie is continuing to take apart the franchise's history of violence against women. Le Chiffre is a dark mirror of Bond in this scene. When the fight comes to Bond and Lind, Bond has to step in and fight off the attackers, but things are still not set in stone. Vesper finds a way to have active agency in the fight. She wrestles away the gun from one assassin. She's not just a passive Bond girl. She's not, Princess Buttercup half-heartedly poking at a giant rat. Yet, Vesper is still shaken by this, and rightfully so. She just watched Bond murder some people. Yet, Bond comforts her in the shower, revealing a shocking amount of vulnerability. Unlike Le Chiffre with Valencia, Bond clearly cares about Lind. There's this borderline maternal imagery as he sucks the bloodstains from her fingers. He is intimate, and we see a glimpse of the sort of transformation and synthesis that might be available to Bond. There's a balance here. He can be appropriately physical and aggressive out of protection, not out of ego, and he can also be naturally nurturing and open. With this relationship, maybe Bond can find the synthesis he so desperately needs between these disparate identities. This is all put to the test in the third act transition when Lind and Bond are captured by Le Chiffre. Le Chiffre's torture is an obvious and memorable attack on Bond's perceived masculinity, aiming to destroy Bond's testicles until there's nothing left to recognize. In the book, Bond is so shaken to his core by this, so haunted that he chooses to resign. But in the movie, Bond meets the torture with gusto. He jokes to Le Chiffre throughout, and what was once a moment of horror becomes a moment of triumph. All because the Bond of the movie has shifted the locus of his selfhood, his perception of his own masculinity. When he retires, it's not because he's haunted by evil or whatever, but because of the life that he chooses to take with Vesper. He appears to have shirked off his self-serving, egotistic, masculine tropes through this relationship and has become a more selfless, more open person. His identity has been redefined. Even though his physicality is compromised, he has a higher value in himself. Bond, as a result, is finally happy, he's healthy, he's balanced, and he's satisfied. But, and this is the grand twist of Casino Royale, but the movie can't leave its new Bond here. Because so far this is just deconstruction, to the point that we don't even have 007 anymore. And perhaps that's the strongest critique in the whole movie. Bond can't be happy, he can't be satisfied, he can't be well-adjusted, he can't be a healthy man and still be 007. Those identities are still in direct conflict. If Bond is happy and healthy and well-adjusted, we can't have a franchise. If we end his story here, we can't have any sequels, we can't have any gadgets, we can't have any fancy cars. So the movie necessarily becomes a tragedy.
I kill! Allow me.
Lynn's mysterious past catches up to the both of them, and she ends up dead in Bond's arms, the culmination of this awful motif we've been tracking throughout. Upon learning about Vesper's past from M and the love that Vesper gave everything up for, Craig's Bond is entirely stoic. He deflects M's attempts to comfort him personally. He turns back to his mission, to the job at hand. And when asked if he needs more time to process, he coldly replies with the final line from Fleming's book.
Job's done. The bitch is dead.
This isn't the reckless hothead we were introduced to at the start of the movie, and it's also not the vulnerable, balanced Bond from the film's middle. Now he's cold, detached. We don't end with an exciting chase scene or a fun gunfight. We end with the death of Bond's innocence as he transforms into a cold shell of a man. If he can't feel, he will become emotionless. He becomes the obedient, dehumanized tool of the MI6, taking out his anger on a revenge mission. Here, Craig's Bond finally fills out the motifs of Bond: the tuxedo, the gun, the Bond James Bond, and the classic theme.
The name's Bond. James Bond.
But it feels hollow. Like, it's cool, it's exciting for sure, but there's a bitter aftertaste to all of it. Unlike Batman Begins, where the reconstruction feels cathartic, this is a tragedy. 007 isn't a mantle Bond has struggled to earn. It's a mask that he wears. His heart is shattered, and his vulnerability is gone, and he falls back into broken toxicity, now of repressed emotion instead of self-centered ego. He becomes M's dispassionate agent. Behind the shiny veneer of the typical Bond affair is the broken past of a man who has nothing left to live for. See, Casino Royale fascinates me because it takes a whole lot of gall to say, hey, our franchise hero is kind of an awful, broken person, and he's probably at his absolute best when he isn't doing the thing that we all want him to be doing. The next 4 movies all kind of struggle to figure out exactly what to do with that. Quantum of Solace is entirely dedicated to Bond's revenge bloodlust, but feels aimless in its depiction. It doesn't critique this so much as it displays it. Where violence against women was in Casino Royale a direct critique against Bond's character, it shows up throughout Quantum of Solace more or less uncommented upon. It gets even worse in Skyfall, where Bond is fully disinterested in the execution of the sex slave he promised he would save.
It's a waste of good scotch.
The movie ends with the death of M, the one character who could stand against Bond throughout, now reduced to a maternal figure in his arms. Skyfall and Spectre both kind of take up this GoldenEye-esque theme of, is Bond outdated? Does he work in the modern era? But they still don't feel like they know what to do with that question. Because we as an audience need to pretend Bond is still relevant in order to keep making these movies. And yet throughout, Bond continues to be tormented by his past. We can't really have the quippy Bond of the past once we have gotten to this level of deconstruction. Vesper continues to appear throughout all of these movies in flashback. I won't talk too much about No Time to Die, but all of these themes are still at the forefront, and its answer to these tensions is a bold one. No Time to Die does get back at this idea that, hey, maybe Bond shouldn't be 007, maybe this is a bad thing for him, and for me, that is the most interesting thing that this movie brings to the table. I'm beginning to think maybe I'm not a Bond fan. Like, I enjoy the Bond movies for what they are, but maybe I'm more just a Casino Royale fan, because I'm really here for the way that this movie treats its character. It elevates this franchise to a whole nother level. And this is what happens when you practice deconstruction to this extent and think, maybe there's nothing left here to salvage. Maybe this isn't worth reconstructing. I'm sure after Craig will get a new Bond, and maybe he'll be one who is able to resolve all these tensions that are inherent in the character, but I honestly don't think we will. I think maybe Casino Royale is right. Maybe it's best we leave Bond alone and stop forcing 007 onto him. And hey, we have a bunch of really good Mission Impossible movies. We have other spy movies. Christopher Nolan, who we talked about earlier, he made his own Bond movie, by the way, and it was called Tenet, and I'll take 5 sequels to that instead. Give me some brain-melting time travel adventure with John David Washington and Robert Pattinson. Give me that crazy score by Ludwig Göransson, and give me more temporal pincer movements, damn it. That's what we're all here for. Hell yeah, take 2.